Or send a self-addressed business-size stamped envelope to C-SPAN $100,000 National Scholarship Competition, 400 North Capitol Street Northwest, Suite 650, Washington, D.C., 20001.
Voting is definitely important, so you have a voice.
C-SPAN, the political network of record.
Next, Phillip Agee, the 12-year CIA veteran and author, talks about his new book on the CIA. He spoke earlier this week in Fullerton, California.
Good evening. This is not on. Can anyone hear me? These aren't on. Where's the switch? This one, okay. Can everyone hear me now? Good. All right, good evening, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to Cal State Fullerton. The organization that is putting this event on is AS Productions. We're responsible for basically all of the entertainment and lecture-type series on the campus, entirely student-run and funded. So we hope you enjoy this. As always, we are in desperate need of volunteers to help us in any minimal way whatsoever. I mean, if it's you know someone in the media that you can contact, if you know organizations in the area or outside the area that are interested in these type of programs, we really would love to meet you. My name is Alex Tijerina. I'm the co-director for the program. In the back there, standing with the camera around his neck, is Randy Thomas. He's also the co-director. I'd like to thank two people in particular, Delia Maldonado and Tracy Thomas, two of our strongest volunteers that we've had all semester. They've helped us very, very much in putting this event on. I also like to thank several organizations. One of them is the Titan Bookstore, which is off here to my left, your right, who have been here since last year, coming to most of our events and providing us with some really good literature. And most of the literature here applies to everything that Philip will be talking about tonight. Also, some organizations are outside here. We have the Sierra Club, who has a very strong showing here tonight. We also have Justice Vision, which has a lot of our events that we've had in the past on videotape for a very economical price if you would like to purchase one of those afterwards. And if I'm forgetting, oh, and PART, People Against Racist Terror, who have plenty of free magazines for you to read. Also, for those of you who don't know, C-SPAN is here tonight. This event will be nationally rebroadcast in the coming weeks, so keep your eyes open for that. We also have a local cable access television station from Long Beach who are here. They will be videotaping it tonight, and of course, Justice Vision is videotaping tonight. And we'd like to thank KPFK Radio for coming down to record this event, so you'll be able to hear that again. Well, I'm getting tired up here. We'll jump right into it. For those of you who don't know Phillip Agee, he was the first CIA covert operative who went public and pretty much let the world know what was going on in the CIA. There's good and there's bad sides to basically every coin. Normally we only get to hear the, quote, good sides, but he shed a lot of light on a lot of the, quote, dirty work that was going on within the CIA, if you want to call it that, that's very lightly, with the death squads and all sorts of other atrocities that were happening throughout the Western Hemisphere and throughout the world. He suffered a lot of personal damage for that. He was completely ostracized from 5 countries under the pressure of the United States government. And only last week was he allowed formally back into England, where he was invited by the House of Commons last Thursday, and he gave a speech in honor of his formal re-entry into England. So we'd like to give him a thanks for that. Congratulations. I'd like to prep tonight by telling you that he's going to give a lecture that he's never given before. He's been working very diligently to write this lecture, so you're in for a real treat, I believe. For those of you who are not familiar with the books that he's written, I'm just going to mention 2. One of them, the first one that he wrote, and probably one of the most popular, is Inside the Company, a CIA Diary, which I believe is no longer in print in the United States, which is why we don't have it here for you tonight. The other one is his autobiography, On the Run, which describes in detail what was going on after he published that last book. And we have plenty of books over there, and he will be signing some of those books if you'd like to buy one of those books and like to have him sign it. And with that, I'd like to introduce Phillip Agee.
Thank you, Alex, for that introduction, and I would like to add my thanks also to Associated Student Productions for the work in putting on this meeting tonight. I'm going to talk a little about the United States intelligence community today and in the years ahead. It was, in fact, a really gratifying experience to go back to London last week because it was 18 years since I had been expelled, deported from Britain along with my family, and that had been followed by deportations from France and from Holland and Germany and Italy, and refusal of entry by Norway, all NATO countries under pressure from the United States. And the last time I had been in the House of Commons in 1977 was to watch from the gallery the debate going on over my deportation. And we knew, of course, the way it was going to come out. And so what good news it was, and how gratifying to be invited back by Labor Party MPs, Labor having been in power when they expelled me. But it wasn't really their fault. It happened that Henry Kissinger, because of a trip I had made to Jamaica, trying to assist the Manley government of the time, a social democratic government, resist the efforts by the CIA to overturn his government, that Kissinger took this step of secretly intervening. I didn't know until years later, when I got the documentation under the FOIA, that Kissinger had made two secret trips over to London in the wake of my trip to Jamaica to take up my case and my trip to Jamaica with the British government. And just a few weeks after that, the police in Cambridge came around to my door at 8 o'clock one morning with a deportation notice. Well, we defended legally and we defended politically. I went all over the UK giving speeches, and there was a tremendous response in my support. But in the end, I had to go. And as I say, it was extremely gratifying to be invited back to the House of Commons for a speech after all these years. The question arises with respect to the current tasks of the United States intelligence community, including the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, today and in these years ahead. One hears most often the common wisdom that the CIA and the rest of the intelligence community is going to have to be focused on international terrorism, the international narcotics trade, such dangers as the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Those are the chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. Also on regional and ethnic conflicts around the world, such as we're seeing all the time and have been for several years in the former Yugoslavia. Still other targets which are coming up all the time in terms of the intelligence community are the rogue states, the so-called rogue states, Iraq, Libya, Iran, North Korea, and for some, Syria. And then, as all of you probably know, they're talking a lot about the intelligence community, particularly the CIA, getting into the collection of economic, financial, and commercial type of intelligence. Well, I'm going to come back to these requirements in a moment, but I would like to set the context with a quick sketch of how I see, how I, for one, see the international political scene into which this future and in fact the current intelligence operation has got to fall. And this to me is extremely alarming. I refer to the extraordinary growth of the extreme right, both in Europe and in the United States over the past 10 years or so, or say 10 or 15 years. Right now in Europe you have a scene which is roughly divided between those parties and organizations that engage in electoral politics, and on the other hand, those which reject electoral politics and engage in terrorism and all types of violence. On December 17th, to raise one example, the Austrians will go to the polls again. The traditional coalition between the conservatives and the social democrats in Austria broke down a few weeks ago, and now they have to go back to the polls. The Austria Freedom Party, led by the neo-Nazi yuppie Jörg Haider, gained 23% of the vote in the past elections, which were only last year. The polls show his party now gaining about 25% or even pulling up even with the two traditional parties. And this is, I must say, a very alarming factor. In Italy, the neo-fascists have already come to power last year in the March elections, and that government lasted for 9 months until it fell. It was a coalition of the neo-Nazi, neo-fascist party, the MSI, or Italian Social Movement, which took on a new name, the National Alliance, in January of last year in preparation for the March elections. They were in coalition with the Berlusconi party, Forza Italia, and the racist Northern League, which is a regional party. But they did win the elections with something like 43% of the vote, and later on in the European parliamentary elections of last year, in June, they gathered 49% of the vote, this coalition. They did fall apart, but the neo-fascists are remaining very, very strong in Italy, and it is possible that this coalition will come together again and that they will form the new government when elections occur in the spring. Not a very pretty prospect either. In France, recent municipal elections showed the two neo-Nazi parties there, the National Front winning, the National Front itself winning 15% of the vote, and the other far-right party, led by a man whose name is De Villiers, gaining 5%. So the extreme right in France is gaining at the polls something like 20% now. In Norway, the New Right Party is now the third most voted party. So you see a very dangerous surge of these extreme right, new right, so-called new right parties, which reject completely the teaching of the Enlightenment, of the French Revolution, and such concepts as liberty, equality, fraternity, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. All of this tradition which has led to the liberal democracy, with all its faults, that we have today. And their agenda is something quite different. They reject universal human and civil rights, and they seek to impose very strong, arbitrary, totalitarian government of a neo-fascist stripe. They have simply, these new rightists, starting in the early 1970s, writers in France and Germany, repackaging the fascism of the past to make it more acceptable today. Then, with respect to the violent groups, they are active everywhere. In Britain alone, they had last year about 8,000 incidents based on racism and hate. You've read, no doubt, about the fire bombings of the Turkish homes and cultural clubs in Germany by skinheads allied to these neo-Nazi organizations. They calculate there are something like, in Germany alone, 82 different neo-Nazi organizations. And they are being banned from time to time, and then the same groups pop up again with a different name. They are working in harmony with something like 5,000 skinheads in Germany, and they are standing behind and carrying out the dirty work for, for the two neo-Nazi electoral parties, one called the Republikaner and the other called the German People's Union, both of which parties are believed to have about 25,000 members. The violent scene is thought to include about 43,000 to 45,000 members, and so you're getting up to very close to 100,000 full-time activists in the neo-Nazi scene in Germany. And they are getting away, literally, with murder. The scene is also very interesting in Belgium, where the Flems Bloc is now in control of the Antwerp government. In Britain, it is not a question of electoral politics. They have no strength at all. But they are involved in attacks all the time. I just mentioned something like 8,000 attacks against, and the targets, you know, are the normal targets. They are the people of color, they are immigrants, they are the disabled, and so forth. We know who those targets are in the United States. They're the same in Europe. and, of course, Jews and Jewish monuments. Just last year, the Lübeck synagogue, Lübeck being a city north of Hamburg where I live, was firebombed, the first firebombing of a Jewish synagogue since the Hitler period in Germany. Well, this scene over there in Europe is really very disturbing. No less disturbing is the scene in the United States, where the extreme right has grown so fast. But in the United States, as opposed to in Europe, as you all know, we have this religious content to a very large sector, the so-called religious right. And in the forefront of the religious right, we have the Christian Coalition, which numbers practically 2 million people right now. And they are able to draw new members constantly from the 34 million or so Americans who consider themselves to be born-again evangelists. This religious right is seeking to take control of the Republican Party. As you may know, some of you, the Christian Coalition has said out and out that they hope to control the Republican Party fully by the year 2000. They already have taken control of the state apparatus of the Republican Party in between 20 and 30 states, according to what I've read. What do they want to do? They want to impose a fundamentalist interpretation of biblical law on all the rest of us by legislating into the civil law of the United States what they deem to be the proper morality as they see it, taken from the Old Testament. This is also a position of a growing movement called dominion theology, or best known through the writings of a man whose name is Rushdoony. And these are people who seriously intend to impose their morality on all the rest of us. From the Christian right, we have the remnants, of course, of the tax revolt movement of the 70s and 80s, as expressed through the Posse Comitatus movement, found in the county superiority movement, or the county supremacy movement. And you are probably aware, I would expect, that these people say that there is no higher than the county in the United States, and that the Constitution did not give the federal government the right to collect income taxes. These people were violent in the 1980s, and they continue to exist today. And there are all these other groups on the extreme right in the United States. The Christian Patriot movement, for example, which in turn spawned the private militia movement following the Ruby Ridge shootout and the events of Waco. The FBI apparently estimates that in the private militias in the United States, there are between 10,000 and 100,000 members, which means that they really don't know. They have no precise idea. But there's no doubt that these groups are growing all the time because of the economic situation in both Europe and in the United States. In Europe, within the European Union, most of the countries of Western Europe, about 385 million people, unemployment is at 12%, which translates into 20 million people unemployed. These people are resentful. They are looking for reasons for their condition. And they are, of course, scapegoating, as they always have. The same thing, or something similar, is happening in the United States with the export of millions of jobs. Especially the white men with less education and less skills are wondering what it's all about. They are bewildered, they are alienated, and they are angry, as you know very well. And these are the millions of people from this great pool that the militia movement can draw on. I might just mention that with respect to the Oklahoma City bombing, I think it's very possible that that was carried out by a very small group following the doctrine of leaderless resistance as developed by one of the leading figures in this movement, a man whose name is Louis Beam. He's a former leader of the Texas Ku Klux Klan, a former helicopter gunner in Vietnam, who is now closely associated with Aryan Nations at Hayden Lake in Idaho, not so far in fact, from Ruby Ridge, where the Weaver shootout took place. This is also a very disturbing and alarming scene, and this, to me, is the real danger in the years ahead, because these militias here in the United States are the potential brown shirts of the coming years, and all they lack really is a leader, a charismatic leader. I might also mention another growing movement which is very closely allied with militias, but it's a religious movement, the Christian identity movement. This is a theological development from British Israelism, which came over to this country in the last century and then was developed into an unrecognizable form. These people, and I can't go into this at great length, although I could, but they believe in pre-Adamite people, that God created inferior beings before Adam and Eve, and that the non-Aryans in the world today are descendants from these pre-Adamite people, meaning people of color, of course, and anyone with darker skin than Aryans. They look upon those people, non-Aryans, as mud people, that's what they call them, and they refer to the government in Washington as ZOG, standing for Zionist Occupation Government. They consider the government to be the enemy, just as the militias do. And this is a church movement. They actually have churches, and they have been very strong here in Southern California through the years, since the 1930s. So this is a scene in the United States. And as I look at the picture, the government and those who are dealing with what the targets of the intelligence community should be are being, as always, still blind in the right eye. They speak of the Libyans and the North Koreans and so forth, which are, in fact, legitimate targets. But you will not see the far right in Europe or the United States really on the agenda. It could be now, after Oklahoma City, that the FBI is taking a closer look at the extreme right and at the militia movement, the violent part of the extreme right. But so far, I haven't seen that it, in fact, is happening. Well, consider the CIA today. They have had some very unfortunate developments, as we all know, in recent years. The worst, of course, was the Aldrich Ames case, in which he was able to work for the KGB and then for the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service for nearly 10 years, during which they paid him more than $2 million, of which he spent a large portion in the most ostentatious way. No explanation at all how they did not get on to him earlier. It was plain, apparently plain, incompetence. But not only did he tell the Soviets all that the CIA was doing against them, and he was involved in anti-Soviet operations, so he was in the perfect place to be able to tell them what was being carried out against them. And in fact, according to press reports, he caused the arrest and execution of a dozen or more people in the former USSR. Ames not only did those things, but he also, working with the Soviets, was able to place CIA sources, double agents, which were really under the control of the Soviets. People were feeding false information into the CIA, and it was going to the top level of the United States government. This was just in the newspapers last week. It was going to the top levels of the United States government, including the president. And they were getting this false information. And the CIA, apparently, it's in dispute right now, but there is some reporting that the CIA was actually passing this information up the line to the president and others at the top level, knowing that it was doubtful. Well, that is another thing that Ames did. But that was not the only problem. These are what are known as counterintelligence failures. I might mention here very quickly, kind of at the beginning, the difference in practice and theory between various types of operations. There are three fundamental types of operations in intelligence. One is known in the CIA as foreign intelligence, or FI for short. That is the collection of information from around the world, from open and secret sources, and then the analysis of the information and the reporting of that information to the consumer, that is, to the people who have to have this intelligence to use it. That is the intelligence cycle or the collection process known as foreign intelligence, or FI. The second of the three categories is known as counterintelligence, or CI for short. These are all the efforts that an intelligence service undertakes to prevent the penetration of the service by hostile services. It also includes the efforts by a given service to penetrate other services. It's a kind of two-way street. And the worst failures of the CIA in recent years, of course, have been in this counterintelligence field. The third category is covert action, or CA for short. This is known in the Soviets or the Russian tradition as active measures, but we called it covert action. And these are the ways in which the CIA, which has the charter for covert action in the United States government, has attempted to manipulate the events in other countries through the penetration of the institutions of power, beginning with governments and political parties and military and security services and trade unions, women's organizations, youth and student organizations, churches, and in a very important way, the public information media. These are standard categories, and as I say, these worst failures for the CIA in recent years have been in the counterintelligence field. Iran, for example, since 1988, is reported to have rolled up at least 30 different CIA operations. Then in 1985, there was the defection of Edward Lee Howard, a CIA officer who was trained to go to Moscow and work in the CIA station in Moscow inside the U.S. Embassy. He was found to be involved with drugs. He was fired from the CIA, and he then defected to Moscow. He got away from the FBI, who had him under surveillance, because he had told the Soviets everything he knew about the CIA people, that is, the Russians, who were working for the CIA in the Soviet Union. And these operations began to go bad for the CIA, and so they realized that Howard may have told the Soviets, and so they told the FBI. The FBI put surveillance on him, and one day his wife drove the car out of the garage. It was in Arizona, I think, and she had a mannequin or dummy sitting in the front seat to represent her husband. And the FBI followed the car, and he went in another direction, got away, went to Moscow. He's there now. He was able to tell them quite a lot. Then in 1987, there was a defector from the Cuban intelligence service. His name was Aspillaga. And he was able to tell the CIA that every one of their operations in Cuba that the CIA thought was a genuine operation was in fact a double agent, really working for the Cuban intelligence and security services. As a matter of fact, the Cubans, knowing that Aspillaga had told all of this, ran an 11-part television series in the summer of 1987 in which they showed camera taken of these CIA people working out of the U.S. intersection in Havana, going to put objects underneath stones and in holes and so forth. You see a man and his wife driving out to an isolated section where they would get out of the car with a picnic basket, walk over to this wooded area, and then hide something. The Cubans, in other words, had mounted cameras, hidden cameras, to take video of these CIA people. Well, there were 27 different cases which were revealed on television. All but one were Cubans. Some of them had worked for as long as 20 years for the CIA, and the CIA never caught on. All of them had passed numerous polygraphs or lie detectors, and I think the average period in which they had worked for the CIA was something like 15 years. Well, one of the problems with the CIA's predicament in these years, these recent years, has been the tremendous pressures put on the case officers in the field for recruitments, and they are promoted, and their fitness report is written on the numbers of recruitments that they undertake. Not so much on the quality of the information coming in, but the numbers game again, as in Vietnam. That means that it has gotten so bad that there have been paper recruitments by CIA officers and false reports or fabricated reports coming in from non-existent agents, according to inside sources. It means also that the quality of the personnel has diminished. It has declined to the point where an Aldrich Ames, for example, by all accounts a totally mediocre person, unable to recruit even his next-door neighbor, was able to be in a very sensitive position so that when he recruited himself for the KGB, very, very sensitive information which cost a lot of lives. It also means that the morale has gone down drastically within the CIA, and some reports say that they are actually self-destructing within the Directorate of Operations. Well, I happen to be one of those people who believes that there is a need for an intelligence service because there are dangers and there are legitimate targets. And these ones I mentioned earlier, like international terrorism, the narcotics trade, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, these are all legitimate targets because those are real threats to ordinary people in the United States. But when you take economic, financial, and commercial intelligence collection, I want to assure you that there's nothing new to this. It has been going on all along. It is only spoken of today, I think, as something perhaps new because they are looking for ways to justify the dollar budget that they have in the United States intelligence community. That is more than 10% of the overall defense budget. Of that $28 billion, the CIA receives something like $3 billion. All the rest go to the other agencies because you know we have about a dozen or so. And the bulk of this money goes to the satellite programs and to the National Security Agency, which is monitoring communications and electronic transmissions all over the world. Just this year, there have been two major scandals in Western Europe where the CIA was spying on allies. And this commercial and financial and economic intelligence collection does mean that the CIA and other intelligence agencies will have to be collecting from and penetrating allies in order to get the information. I'm talking about NATO countries and Japan. The first case that occurred this year was in France in February when the French government requested the departure from France of 5 CIA people. 4 of them, led by the chief of station, were working under diplomatic cover in the embassy, and a woman, was working under non-official cover outside the embassy. They tried to recruit a French government official to give them information on the French positions with respect to negotiations going on within the World Trade Organization, or GATT, known as GATT before. The second case was just last month when it was revealed that in auto negotiations between the United States and Japan last summer, the CIA was spying on the Japanese negotiators and tapping their telephones to hear the conversations between the negotiators and the government officials with whom they were working, and also with the auto companies. Cases, excuse me, both of these cases damaged severely the relations between the United States and the other countries. In the case of France, according to press reports, the CIA was forced to close down its entire operation in France and bring all the people out. Well, I say this is nothing new, and I have with me tonight a document which was sent to me. This is as published in a book that I edited with Lewis Wolf in 1978 called The CIA in Western Europe. In 1976, I received anonymously through the mail a State Department document which was classified, and it was the economic, financial, and commercial intelligence requirements as laid out by the CIA. And this airgram, which was signed by Kissinger, then Secretary of State, was sent to all United States diplomatic posts around the world. It was what the State Department was supposed to do to fulfill these requirements. The CIA naturally was fulfilling the same requirements by trying to get this type of information through spies and other secret methods. Two of the KIQs asked specifically, by the way, there were 69 KIQs, or Key Intelligence Questions, for 1975. That was the document I received for 1975. This document, in fact, included not all 69, but numbers 56 through 63. That is 8 topics for collection in this area, because the vast majority, something like half of all of these key intelligence questions, were requirements on the Soviet Union. But these that I received were simply the commercial, economic, and financial requirements, and they were, of course, mostly directed toward the Western world, and Western Europe particularly, and Japan, the most advanced industrial countries. 2 of them asked specifically for information on the economic performance of the major non-communist industrial nations, naming the United Kingdom and others by name, and on the positions these countries were likely to take in coming international trade and financial negotiations. Concerning financial negotiations with the International Monetary Fund, the KIQs, which were in that document, asked for information on the objectives of priority countries, that is, West Germany, Japan, France, and the United Kingdom, and timely reporting on, this is a quote, prepared negotiation strategies including initial proposals and fallback positions. Information on foreign competition for American companies' exports is, as would be expected, of special interest. 2 other KIQs request information on the foreign assets like bank accounts and investment accounts of the major oil exporting companies, particularly the Arabs, on the vulnerabilities of these countries to competitive energy resources, and on the prospects for converting their oil exports into imports of United States military equipment. Anyone who's interested in seeing this, I'm happy to show it to you after our meeting. That document, by the way, the authenticity of the document back in 1976 was confirmed by the United States Embassy in London. Well, not to be forgotten is Cuba. The intelligence community, particularly the CIA, is, without a single doubt, ordered constantly to collect information that will help to enforce the 35-year-old blockade against Cuba. Roberto Robaina said, he is the foreign minister of Cuba, said in a meeting where I was present, that of every 10 possible commercial deals or deals for investment in Cuba by foreign companies, the United States is able to kill 9. And they do this through the collection of intelligence and bringing pressure on governments and companies and individuals to desist from dealing with Cuba. And as a result of this activity, in Cuba and many others are suffering badly. Well, the future of United States intelligence, and particularly of the CIA, has to be seen, I think, within the context of the overall United States international security policies. 2 years ago, no, it's 3 years now, some documents leaked to the New York Times projected United States defense needs over the next 10 years. And they're extremely interesting to read because the overall defense budget was going to be calculated and then justified according to the analyses that these documents contained. And they were not just Pentagon documents, but they were the product of analysis and study and conversations between the Pentagon, the CIA, the National Security Council, and President Bush at that time. And they were used to justify this 5-year projected defense budget of $1.5 trillion. The scenarios that they had drawn up was another war with Iraq, a war with North Korea, simultaneous wars with North Korea and Iraq, a war to defend a Baltic state from a resurgent and expansionist Russia, a war to defend the lives of United States citizens living in the Philippines, in case the New People's Army had prospered, a war to defend the Panamanian government and the canal against quote-unquote narco-terrorists, and their seventh scenario was the emergence of an anti-U.S. global adversarial rival, those are their words, or another quote, aggressive expansionist international coalition. This document went on to say, and this is a quote, our strategy must now refocus on precluding the emergence of any future global competitor. Our first objective is to prevent the emergence of a new rival, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or anywhere else. Another quote from the document is interesting. The United States must account sufficiently for the interests of the advanced industrial nations to discourage them from challenging our leadership or seeking to overturn the established political and economic order. They're talking about allies there. We must maintain the mechanisms for deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role. This is what I interpreted as a global bully unipolar plan for the New World Order. Well, if the United States is going to assert hegemony around the world, then they are certainly going to have an intelligence service and an intelligence input to do it. And there is much overlapping between what I mentioned earlier, foreign intelligence, counterintelligence, and covert action. They overlap constantly. There is also an economic background to these policies, because the United States for at least 100 years has realized that we cannot consume within the country all that we produce. And in order to avoid depression, such as the one that occurred in the 1890s, the United States has got to have access to foreign markets for exporting surplus production from this country. We also have to have access to foreign labor and to foreign resources. To give you an idea of what this means for the United States economy, I want to just mention a few figures. And this comes from an article I wrote a couple of years ago. The economics of Cold War domination meant large transfers of wealth from south to north. And this is still going on today through the so-called neoliberal economic project, also known as the free market system. From 1982, when the debt crisis reached critical mass, to 1990, the net flow of wealth from south to north was $418 billion. And this is transfer from the poor countries to the rich. This net transfer resulted from average monthly payments of interest and principal of nearly $12.5 billion by the South, or a 9-year total of $1.3 trillion. Such payments, as Susan George points out in her book, The Debt Boomerang, were only possible through accumulation of new debt by the poor countries, which by the end of 1990 owed 61% more than they had owed in 1982. Mass misery and environmental destruction in the South are part and parcel of the continuing net transfer. This is continuing today, and the United States is attempting to impose all over the world, but especially in the South, Latin America, and other third world countries, this neoliberal system. And it is a continuation of what I just read. That is, that they are contributing to our prosperity. That is, to those who have prosperity in this country. Even now in Mexico, with NAFTA not even 2 years old, there are grave developments for the peasantry, for example, and for workers in Mexico as a result of NAFTA. Just as there are grave problems for workers in the United States through the export of their jobs to such places as Mexico. Well, where covert action is concerned, there is going to be resistance, and so there is going to be a need to intervene and to do what we were doing during the Cold War against the left. Because wherever there is resistance to this economic system, there is going to be a need for the United States to intervene to help its friends and to be putting down, penetrating, dividing, and destroying those groups and organizations and people whom they see as threatening. I want to give a couple of examples right now on covert actions already undertaken in the 1990s, starting with Haiti. In 1986, the CIA set up SIN. That stands for National Intelligence Service. That was a Haitian service which was set up by the CIA and funded by the CIA, trained by the CIA, and run by the CIA, supposedly as an anti-narcotics organization. In actual fact, they got involved in trading narcotics, as has happened plenty of times in the past. These people were involved in the coup against Aristide in 1991. You know he won 67% of the vote. He only served a few months when the military coup occurred. There is much reporting and certainly much belief that the CIA was very much involved in that coup because Father Aristide is anathema, really, or had been seen as anathema to U.S. objectives in Haiti and the rest of the hemisphere. He was a priest whose beliefs were based on liberation theology. And liberation theology, which comes out of the Medellin, Colombia, 1968 Bishops' Conference, was based on what they call the preferential option for the poor throughout Latin America. And Aristide believed that it was time for the poor to organize and to demand justice. That is one of the reasons, of course, probably the main reason why he was elected with such a huge majority in the 1990 elections. Well, one of the people who worked in SIN as a teacher, teaching on liberation theology, naturally calling it communist, was this Emmanuel Toto Constant. In 1991, with support from the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency, Constant begins to form these death squads that became known as FRAP and got really going in 1992, 93, 94. They killed as many as 5,000 or 6,000 people, murdered them, tortured them to death. Well, he was on the CIA payroll. And this is a type of covert action. It's an intervention to try to control the politics of a foreign country. In addition, according to all reports, and I don't doubt them in the least, having the experience that I have, the CIA was paying salaries to the leaders of that military dictatorship in Haiti. The next country I'll mention is Guatemala. They have been very much in the news lately also in terms of scandals relating to the CIA. It has come out of the Congress. Congressman Torricelli was one of the people responsible for making this public, that the CIA was intimately connected with the Guatemalan military death squads that killed Michael Devine, a United States citizen innkeeper in Guatemala, and the husband of Jennifer Harbury, an American lawyer who was a guerrilla and who was captured and tortured to death. The CIA covered this up from Congress and from the White House, apparently, and now the new CIA director, Deutsch, has fired 2 CIA people involved in this cover-up and has disciplined 8 others. But this is standard procedure, working with these services, to know that they are involved in these activities. And I knew it when I was in the agency. I worked with police and military security and intelligence services in South America. And in fact, in one occasion, I even heard the moans and groans of a person being tortured coming through the walls into the office of the chief of police, an army general in Uruguay. One more thing about Guatemala is that it also came out that in 1990, when George Bush, with a flurry, canceled military aid to Guatemala because of the human rights violations in that country. At the same time, he instructed the CIA to keep on passing millions of dollars to the Guatemalan military, secretly, $5 to $7 million per year. And, of course, as we sit here today, the CIA has its people in the Guatemalan General Staff G2 section, which is their principal intelligence service, and also in the Presidential General Staff, where they have this so-called archivo, or archive, and which forms one of the major death squads in Guatemala. And the killing goes on. It all goes back to 1954, when the CIA overthrew a democratically elected civilian government on behalf of United Fruit Company and installed a military dictatorship, and it has been the same ever since 1954. Finally, I'd like to mention Bulgaria. Quite some different distance from Latin America, but Bulgaria had elections in 1990, and the former Communist Party of Bulgaria had renamed itself, as had so many others. They now call themselves in 1990 the Bulgarian Socialist Party, or BSP in English. They won the elections free and fairly, according to Western observers who were there. They won something like 47% of the vote over the opposition coalition, which won 36%. And they took 211 of the 400 seats in the parliament. The United States would not accept this. And so, through the National Endowment for Democracy, I'm sorry I don't have enough time to go into the background, but this is a U.S. government-funded foundation modeled on the German political foundations. It serves as simply a conduit for money going to the AFL-CIO International Program, the Democratic Party International Program, the Republican Party's International Program, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's International Program. They are spending tens of millions of dollars. And so they begin funding students, they begin funding an anti-government trade union organization, and from the time of the elections on and the victory by the Bulgarian Socialist Party, which had converted itself, by the way, into an electoral party along the lines of social democracy, of Western social democracy, they decided, these opposition groups decided to make Bulgaria ungovernable. And they did it with help from the United States. Not only from the National Endowment for Democracy, but also from the Free Congress Foundation, one of Paul Weyrick's many groups operating out of Washington. Who is the person running this program for him against Bulgaria but Laszlo Pastor? Laszlo Pastor is a man with a long history of fascism. He was a convicted war criminal in Hungary, served 2 years. Then he came to the United States. He was a leading figure in the Arrow Crossed, which, during the fascist period, which was the most fanatic of all the Nazi organizations in Hungary when they had the Nazi dictatorship coinciding with the Hitler period in Germany. This man came to the United States and he attached himself to the Republican Party, and he's been, since the 50s, one of the principal people in the ethnic and nationality organizations of the Republican Party. He is now in charge of this program in Bulgaria, or in 1990, the program in Bulgaria, also assisted by National Endowment for Democracy. The demonstrations go on, and eventually they are successful, and the government, by November, is forced to resign because of a general strike. The United States was not, as has been the case so many times before. I could recite a litany all night of similar cases. They were not satisfied with the decision of the Bulgarian people in a democratic way, electing the party that they did not want, just as they did not want Aristide and Lavalas in party in Haiti, or they did not want the Labor Party in Brazil in the early 1960s in power. All of these examples of people being elected, parties being elected, governments being elected, and the United States not accepting democracy, but overthrowing them. And that's what they did in Bulgaria in 1990. The reason was not only that these people were former communists, but that they were going to go slow in terms of the reorganization of the economy. They were not going to apply the shock therapy which had been applied with such disastrous results in Poland and in the former Soviet Union. They did the same thing in Albania in 1991. The Former communists reorganized as a new party, won an overwhelming victory in the 1991 elections in Albania. What happened in Bulgaria then happened in Albania, and the government was forced to resign. Well, the CIA at the moment, according to most of the reports, has a covert action budget of about $500 million. But it's not really clear because all of these figures are supposed to be secret. But the best guesses that I've read calculate it to be between $500 million and $1 billion for secret intervention in the affairs of other countries. And I believe that this is going to certainly go on in the future because you can see what is happening in Mexico. There is opposition to this neoliberal economic project. It is not just in the Zapatista movement, but remember that they went into action on January 1st of last year, the day in which NAFTA went into effect. And they knew what was going to happen with this so-called free market policy. And so they opposed it. But it's not just the Zapatistas that are opposing it, but around the Zapatista movement, there is a huge support movement that developed in Mexico, as well as the main opposition party led by Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas. And so there is going to be resistance in all of these countries, and I don't have the slightest doubt that the CIA is working overtime in Mexico, trying to help the Mexican government put down the Zapatista movement in Chiapas, and everywhere else the opposition is cropping up in Mexico. They're doing it because they have always supported the PRI, and they want stability before anything else in Mexico. And I have a feeling that they are now preparing perhaps for a transition of power to the PAN in Mexico, and they want to make it as stable and problemless as possible. Finally, the question arises, we know what the solutions of the right, of the extreme right, are to the problems that we face today, this structural unemployment. We know what the Gingrich Plan is, the contract with America to try to reduce the social safety net to the bare minimum, to, well, you know all the plans that he's putting forward. I don't have to even mention them, but even to the right of Gingrich, there are many others who have even more extreme solutions to the problems. And I mentioned some of these groups already. The question is, what is the left doing? Is the left leaving the scene for dominance by the right and the extreme right in the United States? Is the left slumbering through this out of shock from, for example, the elections of last November? I think not. The very fact that all of you are here tonight shows that there is certainly interest in a more humane, I think, solution to all these problems. And the fact that Fidel Castro was given such a marvelous welcome in New York City. I don't know about the Time magazine in the United States, but the Time that came to me over in Europe has Fidel on the cover again, featuring the fantastic reception that he got by so many people, from so many people in New York City when he was visiting the UN just recently. So there's no question that, that people are out there who are looking for progressive solutions to all of these problems. It is true, I think, that the CIA and none of these committees that are right now examining the role, the future role of the intelligence community, and here I've forgotten if I mentioned, but there is a joint White House-Senate committee looking into the future role. That was led by Les Aspin until he died. There is one in the House of Representatives, and on the outside of the government, there are such groups as the 20th Century Fund, who are also looking into these questions of the future of the United States intelligence community. Not once have I seen so far that they are interested very much in the extreme right that has grown so dramatically in recent years and has such extreme solutions of their own to the problems. But I think certainly there is and there are progressive solutions to all of these problems that we have got to find. But one thing is certainly clear. We cannot do it on our own as individuals. There is no strength in an individual in these situations. One has to belong to an organization. And this is just as true in political organizing and political pressuring and lobbying as it is in a trade union movement. An individual worker has no power at all before the management. But they do have power when they unite. And the same goes for all the rest of us who want to see progressive solutions to the problems that affect us every day. And so I would simply leave you with the exhortation to, if you're not involved yet and you want to see solutions, humane solutions to the problems, then one has to get involved with a group. There is a green movement, of course, around. There are student organizations. There are new parties which people are trying to form. And, of course, there is always the solidarity movement. And if I were back in the States, I think my first choice would be to work in solidarity with Cuba. In fact, I'm doing it all the time over in Europe. The importance of the Cuban Revolution's survival cannot be overemphasized because they have shown that they can take care of their whole population in terms of health care, education, and even make significant strides toward decent housing for everyone, even though they are essentially an underdeveloped country, or a developing country, however you look at it. But they have an average income of something like, per capita income, of something like $2,500 a year. It's probably even less now. That figures from the CIA's yearbook of 1993-94. And happily, they have turned the corner in Cuba. I was there in June, and I just spoke with someone else today who had been there later than I had. And we were both in agreement that things are looking a lot better than they did just last year. But it's very important for all of us because they have shown that with an inclusionist system, which does not marginalize huge proportions of the population, they can provide for everyone. And if they can do it, certainly we can do that in this country. The problem, of course, is that we have an exclusionist system, and it is a system which is marginalizing larger proportions of the population all the time. Millions and millions of people who are becoming redundant. They're not needed anymore. They are simply surplus. So I would simply leave you with that as an idea that I don't know what you have in terms of solidarity with Cuba here, but remember that there is a national organization called Pastors for Peace. And this is a church-based organization based in Minneapolis. And they organize caravans, peace caravans for Cuba. And they've done some for Mexico also. They used to start in Canada and come down from all different areas. They could have maybe 10 or 15 or even more different caravans of trucks which go and they stay in churches and they collect all sorts of things for Cuba. School supplies, medicines, and so forth, food. And then they would cross the border in Texas, and the stuff would be shipped from Tampico. But now it's different. They are starting in the south of the United States, and they are moving toward Canada, where the stuff is shipped from I believe, from Montreal. Here in Orange County, you can have a relationship with Pastors for Peace, and you can be sure that in a future caravan, that caravan can come through this county and receive the support of people like you in terms of getting food and medicine and school supplies and so forth. That's one suggestion that I might make. Well, I've gone way over my time, I see here. I simply would thank you all very much for coming again and for your attention. And why don't we raise it to questions and some kind of discussion now? Thank you very much for that.
Questions. This is the microphone where you can come and ask questions. I heard a lecture a while back by Michael Perini. He had a little ingenious method of determining who goes first, who goes second, and whatever. He said, why don't we just have it, we'll start off with a woman, then we'll go a man, then we'll go a woman, then we'll go a man, or whatever. And that way, everyone will have equal opportunity. So if we can do that, everyone's not scared to ask a question, please come up. The other thing is, a couple of announcements that I forgot to make is, this is our mailing list outside. We have plenty of shows that are coming up next semester. If you're not on this, please put your address on there. We will be having Howard Zinn coming in April. It will be his only Southern California appearance in 1996.
Don't miss him. He's terrific.
He's excellent. He's the author of People's History of the United States, and there are other people to come. And with that, go ahead and ask your questions.
By the way, I tried to keep away from personal matters tonight, but if anybody wants to know about my $4 million lawsuit against Barbara Bush, just ask me, or my $6 million lawsuit against the government for a murder plot in the early 1970s, I'll be glad to tell you all about them.
Hi, I'm from the Sierra Club in Orange County. I'm the Orange County Political Events and Cultural Events representative. And we are very much concerned what happens with rotten government. Rotten government equals rotten politics or vice versa, and then you get a rotten environment. They're all inextricably involved. You really can't separate any of them, and we're working for environmental justice and really working hard. You can join us for cents a day. We have student rates. This is not a commercial, but we really want people to get active in Orange County, and this is just one of the avenues that is offered to you. Now to a question. In Germany, I understand fascism never died and is definitely on the rise. How safe is it for my friends who are from the country of Eritrea, which is just north of Ethiopia? How safe is it for them to remain living in Germany?
They're taking their chances. It is a roll of the dice, more or less. And you never can tell when these people are going to attack. And they will attack simply because a person's skin is black, yes, or because they look different, or they look like a Turk. They're out looking for people to attack, the skinheads are. And the skinheads are very closely allied, or very much a part of the neo-Nazi movement in Germany. As I mentioned, there are more skinheads in Germany than in any other country. The ADL calculates that there are some 5,000 or so in Germany. So I think any person, I have a very good friend there, former student of mine at the University of Hamburg, who's coming around from time to time. Her name is Sheila Jackson. She comes from Chicago. And she talks about the problems that she has, and they are really very serious. And she's nervous. But she's staying there for a time being and before coming back to the United States. But it is a calculated risk for any person of color to live in Germany right now. And certainly the same applies to Jews. It applies also to anti-fascists. There is an anti-Antifa movement among the within the neo-Nazi movement in Germany, and that is they are going out and searching for and attacking people who are working against them. They've even published hit lists with names and addresses. And so there, in fact, in Germany, less attacks going on now than there were 2 years ago. But that's mainly because the Kohl government has adopted much of the extreme right program to take the winds out of their sails. It's a danger, yes.
Yes, I'd like to address a question to you about the, I hesitate to call it the national security state because that sounds like it's too unified. There's a woman poet, she made the observation that you have a secret ballot and they have a secret government, and never shall the two meet. I think she hit the nail on the head. And it seems to me that the only real checks and balances aren't the ones we were taught about in government class, but rather the infighting within and between these intelligence organizations that comprise the national security state. And my question to you would revolve around the events in Oklahoma. Given the historical background of how the FBI, for example, operated in San Diego with the secret army organization, they always tend to penetrate at or near the top of those organizations. The SAO, they ran the number 2 man. They provided 80% of the financing. It was a right-wing paramilitary group, the offshoot of the Minuteman organization. My question to you is, these militia units, would it not be, since they're not a homogeneous group, but rather heterogeneous, would it not be likely that there is a good deal of penetration at or near the top of those militia groups by various elements within the national security state?
I think it's likely to assume that, yes. I think it's valid, to assume that they are penetrated. At what level, I couldn't tell you, of course. They certainly didn't stop the Oklahoma City bombing, and that is one of the reasons for penetrating, is to anticipate these types of operations. They were not able to penetrate World Trade Center bombing either, but that was not militia. That, as we know, was foreign, foreigners at least, and for different motives. But yes, I think that certainly they are taking them into account since Oklahoma City. Whether they put much emphasis in the private militias before Oklahoma City, I don't know. It seems, I have the impression that they did not. But they certainly better right now, because those people are going to carry out more bombings. They view the government in Washington as the enemy. And as you read more about them, you see how they are using high tech. They have the info telephones, they have the faxes, they have the internet, and they are in contact with each other. Even though with this doctrine of leaderless resistance, wherein very small cells will be formed within a larger group, and no one else is to know about this very small cell. And among the cells from the different groups, they will not know each other. That is a, I think I mentioned already, a doctrine which was promulgated by this neo-Nazi Louis Beam to prevent penetration of these small action cells. They are organized along the order of the 1980s, which came out of William Pierce's book, the Turner Diaries. And that was a group of up to 40 people who were involved in bank robberies and armored car holdups and murder during the 1980s, 83, 84. But I think that's the best answer I can give you to the question. I think, yes, certainly the government, if it's not, it certainly should be.
Well, thank you very much for your answer.
You're welcome.
Thank you. My name is Richard Rose, and I'm a declared candidate for Congress against Bob Dornan in the 46th Congressional District. And I'm representing the Peace and Freedom Party of California, the only socialist party in the state. I have two questions. One, why is it that it seems that the only responses to the rise in fascism in this country is by the quiet twin brother of the Republican Party to give us more laws that seem to erode our constitutional rights as American citizens? I refer to the new plan by the FBI to tap more telephone lines and to place more surveillance on individuals.
I know I read that plan about the FBI the day I was leaving Hamburg. I could not believe it. They want to be able to tap, what is it?
1%.
1% of all the telephone calls in the major metropolitan areas. And that turns into the tens of thousands of calls. I can understand why they want that type of information, because, or that type of permission, because they can get a lot of information that way. But the trouble is the targeting. Who is going to be targeted? They talk about narcotics, for example, as justifying these telephone taps. But it really is a frightening thing when you stop to think about it, that privacy will be so infringed. I got used to it a long time ago. I used to do things on my telephone, and I could predict what was going to happen next, and it usually happened, because I knew what they were doing. But I don't really get your question, I don't think.
Why is it that the Democratic Party and the people therein and members thereof have not raised their voices against the laws and the new rules that are being passed that will simply assist the rise in fascism in this country? And they're doing it in the name of going after these militias, and at the same time they're going to be eroding our civil rights.
Well, I think the answer to the question is
why doesn't the
that
Democratic Party
you would
speak
agree
up?
that the Democrats are not going to oppose these measures. The main reason being that there is so little difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. I mean, I've always thought for many years that we really had a one-party system in this country with two wings of the same parties giving themselves different names. And I think it's it's the same situation today. What we need really is the resurgence of additional parties. We need perhaps proportional sort in the United States.
Yay.
There are all sorts of solutions to these problems. But what we have to do is recognize the threat from the extreme right in this country and elsewhere, and understand that this is a very flawed system we live under, but it is not the worst one under which we could live. There are much worse ones out there, and so it's important to keep in mind that we want to preserve this liberal tradition from the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, which has brought us some good things and some bad things, but socialism comes from the very same tradition, and so does humanism. And these concepts are rejected by and they're held in contempt by the extreme right, no matter where you find these people. And it is something for us to defend and to carry on with developing a better society all the time, more justice, more equality of opportunity, and so forth. Little we have.
My second question is this. We've recently heard that there was a microvirus created by the United States government and sold to Iraq, and that this microvirus may have been used by Iraq in the war of the Gulf War. When a person we have been told that when a person called Bob Dornan's office to inquire about this information of what's now being known as Gulf War syndrome, or by the VA as gold bricking, the person was hung up on and immediately was recontacted by the National Security Agency. Is there any reason to believe that this information is true?
I couldn't tell you. I didn't hear that. I'm unfamiliar with the story of the virus. I'm not unfamiliar with the Gulf War syndrome and how it's afflicted so many people. But we will recall the Agent Orange episode 2 from the Vietnam War. They didn't want to recognize the damages caused to GIs from the use of Agent Orange, and they still are refusing to recognize that this Gulf War syndrome is really a widespread thing coming out of the Gulf War. They recognize individual cases of problems, but I don't think they recognize so far that there is an institutional question involved. I don't know about the virus, though.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I wanted to ask a little further about this question of the relationship between the security and intelligence community and the racist and right-wing forces. There have been a number of exposures recently in Canada where the Royal Canadian Mounted Police apparently and the Wackenhut Corporation had people at very high levels not really penetrating but actually building up the neo-Nazi apparatus in Canada, and on the other hand that the white supremacists in Canada had extensively infiltrated the Canadian Army Special Forces, and in the Somali incursion several of them had been involved in literally racial attacks against Somali people, killing a number of Somali civilians to earn their points to be white supremacist warriors. And in Germany, some similar recent disclosures. I think Der Spiegel has put out that one of the main leaders of the neo-Nazi movement in Germany is currently on trial with a man named Alphins, is apparently an operative for German intelligence. And on the other hand, in this country, we've seen that Larry Pratt, who is one of the leaders of the militia movement, you mentioned the situation in Guatemala, and in fact, he is somebody who had been part of the Reagan foreign policy apparatus involved with the Council on Inter-American Security, and wrote a book which was the model for the militias in this country about the experience in Guatemala of the civilian armed patrols, which were used as a counterinsurgency force to augment state power in Guatemala, to do what the Army and the CIA-backed forces couldn't do themselves. They evangelized Guatemalans and armed them to carry out warfare against the similar experience he talks about in his book in the Philippines, where John Singalab was involved in arming sort of the right wing of the Aquino movement, also a kind of Christian populist force that was given weapons and used to as a counterinsurgency tool in the Philippines. And then he takes that model and applies it to the United States and says we have to form these Christian militias. So I think that there's really, at the beginning, these security forces and intelligence agencies need to pay more attention to those groups, but I think there's a more malicious reciprocity that goes on between at least some elements of these national security and counterinsurgency operations and the racist right and fascist forces you're talking about. So I was wondering if you could comment on what you perceive, for example, in Germany now or in the United States, to your knowledge about the role that these security agencies might be playing and actually building up.
In Europe, I haven't seen any indication that, I don't think I've seen any indication that suggests government involvement in the building up of these forces, because the governments over there are competitors with these political forces in the electoral sphere, and certainly where the violence is concerned, the governments stand nothing to gain through this violence that is carried out against the usual targets. So I don't think I've seen anything in Europe. In America, with the exception of the Canadian situation, I don't recall any indication that there have been, on the federal level at least, indicators of support for the development of the private. Have had support in the past. Posse Comitatus also has been on the local and police departments or individual police officers. There they have found quite a bit from the past. And you know, very good books for anyone interested. Terrific books coming out right now on the extreme right in the United States and in Europe. And there are such things as reports from the European Parliament on their investigations of the 80s and 90s into the rise of neo-fascism, neo-Nazism, xenophobia, and racism. So there's an enormous amount of reading material out there for those people who are interested, and you can find it without the least trouble. Yes?
Yeah, I had a lot of questions, but I'll ask you too. Whatever did become of that United Fruit Company in Guatemala, and also how is the CIA involved with the United Nations foreign policy? And you mentioned Mexico in the South as far as what I would call suppressing the unions and keeping the wages low in Mexico. And you mentioned a little bit about resources. And then at the same time, I don't think they could be so stupid to know that that would cause massive immigration over here, which I still believe the United States lies in its historical books about the conquest of the southern states of Mexico. So I'd like to, for you.
Yeah, that first question about Guatemala, I didn't quite get that.
Whatever it became of the United Fruit Company that you mentioned.
Well, at one point, the president of United Fruit, or CEO of United Fruit, jumped out of the building in Boston, killed himself. I think his name was Black. And then it may be that the company split or they changed its name. But I'm not really sure if Chiquita Brands is what was formerly United Fruit. Maybe someone here knows. You're nodding that it is. Yeah, and United Brands is the new name they took on. And I think they've even changed that one now. But United Fruit or United Brands, those banana companies, they jump around from country to country because the soil is only good for about 20 years for growing bananas. And in Guatemala, it was a real scandal the way the CIA intervened, because the Guatemalan 10-year revolution of October was the best thing that had ever happened in Latin America since the conquest. They put top priority on education during the first few years. And then when Arbenz came in 1952, they enacted an agrarian reform, which affected the lands of the United Fruit Company. And it so happened that on the board of United Fruit, not on the board, sorry, senior partners in the law firm that served United Fruit, Sullivan and Cromwell in New York, were the two Dulles brothers, Allen and Foster Dulles. John Foster Dulles was then Secretary of State for Eisenhower, and Allen Dulles was the director of the CIA. Eisenhower approved a plan to overthrow the government and to turn the clock back in Guatemala, and that happened. And it has been one horror story ever since 1954 when that occurred. And we can see that the CIA is still in there like they always were. And before it was to counter communism or to defeat communism. The guerrilla movement and the government are in talks right now, as some of you will know, and the chances are that they may be able to keep this peace process going and stop the war. But only recently the government visited a massacre on a bunch of peasants who were coming back, a group of peasants who had come back from years of exile in Mexico City. So Guatemala has a very long way to go before it's can be called a respectable place to live or to support.
1988 Mexican presidential elections. Mr. Cardenas, the center-left party candidate, by all accounts except the PRI, he won that election.
Yes.
Of course, he was never seated. One presidential term later, in the 1994 Mexican presidential elections, he came in a distant third behind the PRI and the center-right party, the PAN. First, I was wondering if you believe those election results, if you believe that the center-left party really did almost sink into oblivion in that one presidential term. Secondly, I was wondering if you could tell us the processes that the CIA uses to manufacture election results, and if when you were in the CIA, did you ever fabricate an election or participate in displacing a legitimate government with an illegitimate government?
Well, first, as far as Mexico is concerned, I'm a little bit removed from that scene. I know the PRD has had very large internal problems, and I think those internal problems were reflected in those 1994 elections. Certainly he did not do as well as before. What the CIA might have been doing in there to foment discord within the PRD or to make certain that he did not win the elections in 1994 is anybody's guess. I am not close enough to the scene to come up with speculations on what exactly they might have been doing. I was not involved in rigging elections. We did give money to our selected candidates who usually won. And these candidates would run from a conservative party, for example, in Ecuador, where they, at the party meetings, they had a crucifix on the table, very closely allied with the Catholic Church down there, to the social Christian movement, kind of like Christian Democratic movement, to right-wing social democrats. Our enemies list started with left-wing social democrats to socialists, communists, and so forth, all the way to the armed left. And in elections, we were always involved, yes. I was involved somewhat in the 1964 Chilean elections because we were spending huge amounts of money in the Chilean elections to prevent Allende from being elected, having almost been elected in the previous presidential elections in 1958. In 1964, we poured in millions of dollars to the Frey campaign. That was Christian Democrat. And I was over in Uruguay channeling money, Chilean escudos, they were called at that time, over for use by our station in the embassy in Santiago for the election operation. The CIA, election operations are the oldest, in fact, of the CIA. The very first big operation that came into being with the founding of the CIA in 1947 was the Italian elections coming up in April 1948. And the first item on the agenda for the first meeting of the National Security Council, which was established by the same law as the CIA, the National Security Act of 1947. At the very first meeting of the National Security Council under Truman, they took up the question of the Italian elections, and Truman set aside $10 million, a lot of money at that time, for the CIA to intervene secretly and try to buy those elections for the Christian Democrats. And it was successful. They were afraid that the coalition of socialists and communists, who had been the backbone of the resistance to fascism toward the end of the war, and came out with lots of prestige, might win those elections. And so they continued over the years, for the next 20 or 25 years, they continued to give millions and millions of dollars, perhaps as much as $100 million to the Christian Democrats. That whole system came tumbling down beginning 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, I guess, with this Tangentopoli scandal, the kickback scandal. And not Aldo Moro, but yes, Giulio Andreotti is now on trial for having been the mafia's chief protector, and he was the CIA contact man all through the years. No end to this kind of scandal. I could go on all night. But I think we have to get out of here. I'm going to be back there, I think, right, Alex? Oh, I see. It's over there. All right, I'll be over here signing books, and if you, those other two who are in line, just come over here and I'll speak to you by the book table.